Hello and welcome to another episode of Transforming WHO, a video series where I talk to colleagues about reform and change in WHO, about the WHO transformation agenda. And today I'm very happy to be joined by Björn Kümmel, who's leading global health in the Federal Ministry of Health in Germany. And welcome, Björn, and thank you for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
So Björn, just a little bit about yourself. You're a lawyer by training, by background, a degree in international law, and then you've been working with global health for many years in the Federal Ministry of Health in Germany, of course coordinating German policy on global health with other actors in Germany and inside the EU, etc. But as long as I can remember, Björn, you've also been representing Germany in the governing bodies of WHO, and always I kind of feel with a specific focus on WHO reform. That seems to have been a particular strong point of yourself and of course also Germany. I mean, you represent Germany in the governing bodies. Is that a fair description of you and your role?
Yes, I would say so, true. I'm not really sure for how long I've been covering WHO now. I keep pretending it's been only 10 years, but most likely it's 15 years. And I think from the start I was, I think when I started, I was indeed focusing already on PBAC issues, so reform, budget, administration, HR, and then onwards. Indeed, I was representing Germany on the board.
So you joined the executive board of WHO in 2018, and then you served 3 years on the board. And I think you were even vice chair of the board, and then you also chaired the program, budget and administration committee, the PBAC committee. So that was 2018, before the pandemic, then of course also into the pandemic in 2020. And during that time and during your time on the board, then this question of sustainable financing of WHO came up. It's not the first time in our history that we are addressing that, but it was addressed very much by yourself in Germany and other countries. And eventually that became a working group on sustainable financing that was launched, I believe, in 21, that you chaired. And then it worked for 18 months.
Yes.
Can you tell me a little bit about the background of that working group and why did it come about and what was the purpose?
So, I mean, the challenge of sustainable financing is not new to WHO. As you mentioned, it's been ongoing basically since the creation of WHO, that potentially the organization doesn't have the resources it needs, with a growing part that is voluntary and earmarked and cannot be shifted around, and percentage-wise diminishing part of assessed contributions. And I think that was addressed many times, even before. But I think never ever a real long-term solution was found. And during COVID, I think it became more and more clearer that the expectations that the global world puts on WHO outweighs the ability of WHO to respond by far. So there's a discrepancy in between what we expect from WHO and what WHO can deliver. That became obvious.
So the role of WHO, especially in the pandemic, there was a feeling by more and more member states that we needed to protect that normative leading mandate of WHO.
Not only the normative, but I think, I mean, even in the German public, there was this expectation, now WHO is there, can respond, etc., is well equipped, so take care of the pandemic and it's over. I guess not only in Germany, but everywhere. So there was a completely naive view of the ability of an international organization and WHO. Obviously, WHO is well positioned with its 150 country offices or even more, but with, what is it, 7,500 staff members now, 9,500 staff members, there are limited abilities, and especially with a limited budget, that you can shift around. And I think that was more or less the starting point of the debate back then.
Sure. And just to say, this problem has always been here in our 77-year history, but I think it's fair to say it's been growing, especially since the turn of the century. So roughly the last 25 years, if you look at WHO budget, it has more or less tripled in size, so we've grown. Roughly now the WHO budget is around $3 billion US per year. And back when you started that working group, I think the numbers were roughly that only 17% of that budget was actually covered by our assessed contributions, which is the member state, the dues, the membership fees, if you will. Yes. We have 194 member states and they pay various amounts in assessed contributions, but that only covered 70% of our budget. So 83% is voluntary contributions, earmarked contributions, that can be very inflexible in the organization, right? That was the starting point of that. Can you speak a little bit more. What is that? Why is that a problem?
I mean, it's a huge problem because basically 194 member states clarify in the program budget, in the biennium, what the goals of WHO are and what the expectations of 194 member states are. But on the other hand, they are not providing the funding for that. So the membership fee, the assessed contributions, as you mentioned, at that time were 16-17%, and the rest, as you indicated, were completely voluntary. And the voluntary part is, obviously it's great that voluntary donors provide that funding, but there are lots of challenges linked to the voluntary part. So the first one is it's highly unpredictable. So because it's completely voluntary. So if a member state or any other donor provides funding this year, it doesn't mean that it will be providing funding next year. That's the first challenge. The second challenge is large amounts of that are heavily earmarked. So the donors more or less clarify in the donor agreement for what specific purposes the organization can use it, but it can't use them for any other purposes. So that more or less limits the ability of the organization to shift money around from one key priority to another one if there's a need. And especially in a crisis like COVID, obviously there was a heavy need to be doing that. And that is something that we see in the governing bodies all the time. There is a huge discrepancy in between what member states want, a strong focus, for example, on NCDs, but nobody provides funding for NCDs. So much of the funding comes for communicable diseases and other priorities, but there is a heat map, so basically a chart where you can see all the different programs over all the major offices, and then you see how they are funded. And the unfortunate thing is there might be adequate funding overall, but many of the areas, key areas such as NCDs, are heavily underfunded.
That's what we call pockets of poverty in the lingo.
Yes.
So basically the overall budget might be in balance, but in between it doesn't balance with priorities. We might have some huge priorities in public health because we have member state resolutions telling us to do stuff, but we don't have the adequate funding. Then there might be another program where we have a lot of earmarked funding, so that is probably more in the green. They certainly have the resources, but the other ones don't, and that creates an imbalance, right?
I mean, there are further challenges linked to the voluntary nature of the funding. So one of them, for example, is that 83% of the funding comes from voluntary donations, but it's not one donation, but those are 3,000 grants that WHO has to handle. Often the technical units have to handle that, which means reporting requirements, etc. WHO is a knowledge-based organization with the highest expertise in global health, but certainly not in dealing with donor agreements. But major parts of the work of the technical units, is more or less devoted to donor agreements, reporting requirements, etc., so and resource mobilization.
Directors, etc., inside WHO who should be devoting most of their time to technical work, but they're actually fundraising.
Exactly, and they are not good fundraisers. Yes, they were never trained to do so. Yes,
exactly. And then, of course, another challenge that you also identified in that working group is the fact that we are then dependent on a few very large donors, including your own country and other big donor countries, and including also some philanthropic foundations that we are heavily relying on. And that, of course, creates a risk in sort of we don't have the diversity, right?
I mean, it's not, I would say this obviously is a common risk for many other international organizations and also the split in between voluntary contributions and assessed contributions. But I think it's the one organization that is has the highest risk is, among others, I guess WHO. The split in between ACs and VCs, but also the dependency on, basically traditional donors. It's roughly the top 18 donors account to 85-90% of the entirety of the program budget. And that certainly is unhealthy, especially if you look at the top 3, 4, 5 donors. If one of them vanished, the organization has an issue because it's so heavily dependent on that funding.
We'll get back to that specific problem. So basically when we talk about sustainable financing, it's basically 3 things, right? It's getting more predictability. So we basically know what funding do we have, so we are not stuck in a situation of not knowing that we have a funding of the work we need to do. So predictability is one. Diversity is another thing, basically having a greater diversity of our donor base, so we're not heavily reliant on one. And then the third leg is, of course, the flexibility, less earmarking, more flexibility, so we can actually, inside the organization, allocate for priorities. Would you say that's sort of the 3 important
Yes,
parts of...
there's one additional one that I would highlight internally. So the way we've been funding this organization, all donors together, and WHO, I would say, has created small kingdoms within the organization, donor relations, which are there and which basically potentially are not aligned with the corporate view of this organization. So you have, and I think the fact is that if I was a director in WHO, I would run around doing fundraising for my own department. And most likely I'm not even interested in the donor providing unearmarked resources, but really I would like to, normally when people come to me, they ask for money specifically for their unit. And ask me to earmark it for that unit, because then it's 100% sure that their salaries and their work would be financed. So it's been, I think we have set the wrong incentives, how to finance. Plus, we've created small kingdoms, and I think there's a disincentive to work with one another, WHO as one. A unit that raises resources for its own sake will not work together with another unit, because often enough they are even competing for the same donors.
So that's what we call the siloed.
Yes.
It tends to drive, incentivize a siloed structure, a siloed way of working inside WHO. And this is not, by the way, unique for WHO. I mean, we see it in other sort of multilateral organizations, but it's certainly a WHO problem.
But the only way to break those silos is another way of financing the organization through more, corporate funding, ACs, or more flexible funding that comes in from donors on a voluntary basis, yes.
But then you chaired that working group on sustainable financing. I can recall that. I mean, you came with your recommendations. That was the World Health Assembly in 2022, as I can recall. Then we were sort of back to normal ways of working after the pandemic. You had actually worked during the pandemic in that working group, but then in 2022, you present your recommendations. It was approved by the Health Assembly. They approved an increase of the assessed contribution. So eventually by 2030, I think we will have 50% of our base budget covered by flexible funding, that is. And the other big thing that you recommended is a more sort of predictable replenishment of WHO funding. Back then in 2022, I mean, I remember you presenting this. You called it historic and groundbreaking, etc. And you also gave a lot of interviews back then. And it was certainly also a thing that resonated. Looking back, would you still call it historic and groundbreaking?
I would say so, yeah, to some extent. I mean, obviously, the impact needs to be seen over time, because we only had one step now, and there are further steps that need to be implemented, and we're looking forward, hopefully successfully, they will be implemented. But I think for the UN system, at that moment, it was zero nominal growth. So basically, all member states agreed that within the UN, no organization would receive further funding, an additional assessed contribution. So comparing that to what we achieved in WHO, it was really groundbreaking. And normally, if you're agreeing to an increase in assessed contributions, also in WHO, in former years, after heavy debates, 2-3 years, we achieved a 3% increase. While here we are discussing an increase up to 50%, which means stepwise 20-25% or even higher steps to come. And we achieved the first step, 20%, so that was really exceptional.
And why do you think it was successful this time around? As you say, it had been approached previously in WHO history to fix our sustainable financing, but it failed. But this time around, you were successful. And it wasn't always easy. I mean, you had many meetings in that working group, and it went on. And probably during that, you thought, are we going to achieve consensus? But you did. Why do you think that was?
I think lots of things played in there, and I have to confess, when I was asked to chair the working group, and it became clear that it's about also increasing the assessed contributions, I said no, I don't want to share it, because I thought there was zero chance to do it, knowing that we were not successful before. I think lots of things came together. Obviously, this was a unique window of opportunity after COVID. So there was a clear political incentive on all sides to strengthen the organization. I think the organization itself and the DG were very successful in profiling WHO better than ever before. I think we had a great case. We had a big lobby within the organization, but also outside the organization. Civil society groups really supporting the increase. And I think we were lucky because we're a good team. So I had a good bureau and we were completely aligned. And I think a lesson can be learned from that bureau because we took off our national hat, but tried to be doing this for the organization and not for the sake of our national interests. Plus, there was a very strong alignment in between and complete trust in between the bureau and myself and the secretariat. Yeah. So I think we planned the meetings very well. There was a good group dynamic, and we were working with all regions very, very good. Also that
the dynamic between basically the member state-led process, because WHO is a member state-led organization, but there's also the trust in the secretariat in basically this duality that happened during this mechanism.
Absolutely that, but I think we also made use of the regions to some extent. Yeah, so in the WHO setting, you can do lots of things in headquarters, but especially these big things like an AC increase, you need to have the regions behind you, and we had the regions completely behind us. Yeah.
So the member states, the Health Assembly in 2022, they committed to this assess contribution. That's a sort of a stepwise thing kicking in towards 2030. I mean, this increase in assess contribution and then eventually more flexibility, less earmarking, that can be a difficult sell politically in many, many member states, for sure. I mean, because governments change, political priorities change in our member states, and they will have national priorities in their government, in their parliaments that might direct it. And you lose a little bit of that by having the flexibility of the funding.
That's true, yes.
So do you think our member states will stay committed to this commitment that they made in 2022?
So the commitment obviously is only on one part. So the part that is currently growing, we are currently at, I think, 25% or something, and it hopefully comes to 50% of the base budget. So it's only a smaller part. There obviously remains the other part, the voluntary part, and where you could provide flexible resources, but certainly also potentially thematic earmarking would still be a possibility. But indeed, I think that's a challenge because member states and politicians they have their pet items which they want to have obviously implemented at WHO. Obviously, there are other ways of influencing the organization through adopting a program budget, but also through clarifying the political will, but very clear expectation that specific areas are well funded, the core of WHO's mandate.
And we still have the challenge, I mean, of sometimes, if it might be blunt, that our member states, our governing bodies speak with two mouths. I mean, they commit to flexibility, but on the other hand, they drive the specific priorities. Yes. We see that when passing resolutions in our governing bodies, and then you sit there, okay, but how will they be funded? So I found actually a quote of yours, Björn, back when you were sort of chairing that. Can we have the quote of Björn up on the screen, please? And let's just see what you said back then. So you're basically saying that it seems like member states are ready to order a 5-course meal. They are happy to show up to have a 5-course meal served, but they will only pay for the salad. Is that a quote that you can recognize?
Yes, I recognize. Yeah. I was wondering which quote you're going to take. Yes. Of course, yes.
As a German diplomat, that's not very diplomatic, is it?
I'm not a German diplomat. That's the beauty of it. I'm from the health ministry.
You're German, but okay.
I'm German, yeah, true. I think I'm known to be quite frank and honest and straightforward, and often enough it's been appreciated.
We just had a meeting of our executive board,
yes.
Where the executive board looks at a number of resolutions because they have to process it for the Health Assembly in May. I was watching very carefully and listening in. Yes. There were some reservations in the EB about processing these resolutions and looking at the costs because of the current funding constraints. I mean, can you describe a little bit how this atmosphere might have changed?
So also my country was very skeptical whether it makes sense to adopting 25 resolutions and not knowing whether they will ever be implementable and whether we will be having the resources in place to keep the core functions of WHO running. So from our point of view, and there was another quote which I used in the PBAC, I said, the roof is on fire, we need to extinguish it and then check whether we can fix the roof, and then let's do other business.
Yeah.
Other business is 25 resolutions.
Yeah.
So from our point of view, the key priority is to safeguarding WHO's core function, clarifying that...
So we don't build a new kitchen in the house when the roof is on fire.
And I think that's also something that was quite working well in my sustainable financing working group, because there was a strong connection between me and the Secretariat. More or less, the Secretariat clarified what is doable and what's not doable. So there was a sense of reality check, a double reality check. I was again and again asking, WHO, can you deliver this? Are you really sure? And I think that's missing to some extent. It has been missing in the executive board, but also in ongoing other fora currently. Yeah.
And when we speak about the house being on fire, that's very much the announcement by the new incoming US administration that they will withdraw from the WHO and also withdraw funding, not only for WHO, but for many global health programs. And that's, of course, a huge hit to our operation and to global health, because the US is our biggest funder, both of assess contribution, but also of voluntary contribution. And just in the recent executive board meeting, our program budget for the next 2 years was downsized for that reason. And there was also very much a discussing about prioritizing in WHO. So that prioritization will now be discussed from now on to the Health Assembly with member states and of course internally. How do you see that? What is your expectation of that prioritization?
I mean, it's needed now more than ever. I think that we have not done a great job over the last decades to clarify what is the core of WHO's mandate. From my point of view, and also in the working group, I've tried to nail it down to what is the comparative advantage of WHO. What are the functions that only WHO can perform and nobody else?
Yeah.
And potentially there are lots of things WHO does and they are very good, but potentially others can do them even better or as well. But there are some functions that only WHO can perform.
On the added value of the comparative advantage of
Yes.
WHO, basically.
But it's a tricky exercise, because obviously member states will come in and argue, no, there's also the wish list of member states or the menu they would like to eat will be broader, I'm sure. And also internally, I think, as I mentioned, we've created all these small kingdoms that were paid so far with earmarked resources through donor agreements. It will be very, very tough to clarify.
So maybe not a 5-course meal, but only 3 courses?
Maybe, yes.
Or maybe just a salad?
Yeah, maybe not just the salad.
No,
I think more would be core than that. Yeah. I mean, exactly, yes. But it's going to be a very, very tricky exercise. I'm not sure whether we can wait until May, to be honest, because I think the financial crisis is harder, and I think we need to be active as soon as possible.
Yeah.
I'm convinced that we need a very, very clear leadership in order to get through this difficult situation. It's not only the loss of the largest donor of this organization, obviously a strong promoter and the technical expertise and the long partnership, but even before that happened, I think there was room for clarifying what is the competitive advantage, what is WHO's core, because obviously through COVID, lots of resources were boosted into WHO at a peak, and they fell to zero at this moment. I think both more or less come together now, so it's really an aggravated situation.
Like it happened in most countries in
Yes.
public health authorities,
Absolutely.
for sure, during COVID. And certainly that also indicates why we will continue discussing sustainable financing also going forward. We will continue to discuss the mechanisms of sustainable financing in WHO for these very reasons.
Yes, I mean, one of the reasons why we started was the high risk and reliance on very few donors. If one drops out, then you are facing a challenge.
Yeah.
And the best way of diversifying more or less the burden, the financial burden on everybody's shoulder of all 194 member states is the ACs, because it's based on the ability to pay, which is basically the UN scale of assessment. So it seems to be the fairest way of contributing.
Yeah.
There is obviously a challenge here. I mean, the working group came up with a proposal to increase the assessed contributions, but the second big proposal was to run an investment round, more or less. Yeah, we call it replenishment. And we've done the investment round was successful last year, but it's, I think, worth reflecting on the fact that 90% of the funding that was raised through that investment round came from only one region. And there's even one region that didn't contribute a cent to the investment round. And I think that needs to be reflected, and we need answers why that is the case.
So basically what was addressed by the Working Group for Sustainable Financing that you chaired of getting more diversity in our donor base was the right problem to target, but we aren't there yet. We still don't have the sufficient diversity in our funding.
No,
So,
I think,
yeah.
I mean, the AC part is good. We will see whether we will be successful to implement it. It remains to be seen at the Assembly whether the second step of the AC increase goes through. I'm optimistic, but I think we need to push, obviously, on all sides, that really the countries who have to pay more, especially also due to the shifting UN scale of assessment, are convinced that this is good. And then obviously further steps happen. But the other part, the voluntary contribution part, is obviously as essential for WHO. And there we have to do explain better the comparative advantage of WHO and why it's important to invest in WHO.
Sure. Final question. I mean, it's not only funding that is challenging WHO and indeed the whole multilateral system. I mean, there's a broader challenge to multilateralism in this turbulent world that we've seen actually sort of accumulating in the recent years. I mean, how do you see the future of multilateralism, the rule-based sort of world order, and what does that do for global health?
I mean, that's a tricky question. I would say most likely there's been ups and downs for multilateralism even in the past. So I think this is obviously a severe crisis of multilateralism. I think that it's obviously a turning point and a reflection. Why do we engage multilaterally? Why do we need a rule-based system? And certainly, I think it's important to, keep a rational profile, not to do something hasty, clarifying where is more or less our frame to work together with like-minded, and I'm sure. I mean, I think climate change, but also global health challenges will prove that we need a strong multilateralism and strong international organizations.
So there's a future for multilateralism.
There will always be a future of multilateralism. Since we are so interconnected, it's unthinkable that we are only focusing on what nations do.
Thank you very much, Björn, for showing up, and thank you very much all for watching, and do stay tuned for the next episode of Transforming WHO.